All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on React.js. Before we get started, just want to take a quick survey. How many folks are using React currently? Anybody? A couple of people? Okay. You might be a little bit bored in this session. This is like introductory level, but of course you're welcome to stay. Apparently there's 30 other sessions going on right now, so you have a few to pick from. But what we're going to do in this session is we're going to talk about React.js. And another quick question, how many folks in this room would consider themselves to be advanced JavaScripters? Oh wow, okay, that's impressive. How about kind of mid-level JavaScripters? Beginners? A few beginners, okay. All right, that'll help me tailor the talk a little bit to the kind of audience we have here. So for those of you who are not familiar with React, which is most of you, that's good. React is a UI-only library, so it's basically user interface only. It doesn't have something like what Angular does, which is kind of the full client-side MVC or MVVM type framework. It's a UI only, and if you're using something like Angular, or if you're using Backbone or other types of libraries, you can actually plug React into those other libraries. So how many folks are using Angular in here? Okay, so that's quite a few hands here. So if you're using Angular, you can plug React in as essentially the view layer, the V and the MVC in Angular. And there's some libraries that help you kind of glue those two things together. So it's quite common for folks nowadays to actually think about using React with Angular so that you don't have to use their built-in templating engine and you get all the cool stuff that we're about to talk about in just a second. All right, so we're going to cover some concepts first. Compared to other frameworks, React is a component-based framework, similar in nature to web components from Google, but quite different in terms of how it actually manifests itself. Okay, so let's get into some of the concepts. The first one we want to talk about, let me just make sure we're in the right location here. Yep. Okay, the first concept with React that people are not familiar with is what's known as isomorphic JavaScript, okay, or isomorphic code. And essentially what this means is that React can run both in the browser, which is where you would expect a client-side JavaScript library to run, or you can actually do the rendering on the server. And we'll talk about a few reasons why you would want to render on the server as opposed to render in the browser itself for a single page application. When we talk about isomorphic and kind of exactly where your code lives, it's in this fuzzy area in the middle. So you have JavaScript on the browser, you can have JavaScript on the server running in something like Node.js. And when we consider React and we think about the isomorphic nature of React, your code is basically can be somewhere in the middle. It could be either on the left or the right side, server or on the browser. Okay? So one of the reasons why React is great is because you have this ability to run code in an isomorphic way, you can have a huge amount of flexibility in terms of whether you want to run something on the server, something you can control, or if you feel that the browser can handle what you're trying to do in that specific component, you can run it in the browser as opposed to the server. But it gives you an immense amount of flexibility and performance management, which is something kind of new, especially if you're using something like Angular or a bunch of the other frameworks. But the isomorphic nature is not the main reason why React.js is so fast. Okay? The main reason why it's so fast is it does a couple of different things to help you in terms of managing the performance of your single page app in the browser. Namely, it has something known as the virtual DOM. The virtual DOM is essentially a mirror of the actual DOM, right? I assume everybody knows what the DOM is. It's essentially a tree-based construct which is what the user sees, the user interface. Okay? But with this virtual DOM, whenever you make changes or whenever you're building something inside of React, you always have to go through the React library. You never directly access the underlying actual DOM, right? You never go and grab a div or whatever and make changes directly to it. You always make changes using the React components. So what that allows React to do is it essentially has a virtual DOM that is a mirror of the real DOM. Changes are applied to that virtual DOM, and when React thinks you're ready, it will go and it will batch all the different things that you're trying to change in the DOM, i.e. in the web browser, and it will do a batch update, right? So that's one of the reasons why it's fast, is that it does these batched updates so that you don't have multiple things going on at once and we'll get into the performance bit in just a second. But it's also able to do smart diffing because it keeps a snapshot of what the DOM actually looks like. When you change a React component, it says this component is changing this bit of DOM, so it's able to do smart diffing between what the user actually sees and the changes that you're trying to apply onto the DOM at that point in time. Okay? So when we think about the typical web browser and the typical web browser update, there are a few things that happen in terms of when you make a change, how does it actually go from the change that you're making to being shown to the user in the web browser window. So three basic steps. I'll simplify this a little bit, but there are three basic steps here. The web browser has to parse the markup and the CSS. It has to create a render tree based on the changes that you're making or whatever you're trying to show in your HTML, CSS, etc. And then it has to do a reflow and repaint, right? So you make a change, it has to parse the HTML that you're trying to put into the DOM. Then it has to create a render tree based on that, and the final step is actually showing it to the user, a reflow and repaint. Okay? So, and this is where React comes in and allows you to avoid this. So, if you do a lot of reflows and repaints, that is the part of showing something in the browser that is especially slow. So, if we go back to this slide, the first two parts are actually very, very fast in the browser. Parsing the markup, parsing the CSS, creating the render tree, those two steps are extremely fast because it basically happens in in-memory objects, okay? But the last part where it actually has to do a reflow and a repaint, basically you repaint what the user interface looks like, and then you do a flow and based on what you've done to determine exactly where the elements that you want on the page should look like, okay? So it's the last step, which is extremely slow, and that's what you want to avoid, and that's what React helps you avoid as long as you follow their component model for building a web page. All right? So what can trigger a reflow and repaint? Again, that's the slow part that we want to avoid. What triggers that? Any DOM update will trigger that. If you hide a DOM node, that will trigger a reflow and repaint. If you move or animate a DOM, it has to do a reflow to reposition things in the web browser. If you make any style changes using CSS, again, that's a repaint, and it possibly may also be a reflow in terms of laying out the elements and actually drawing on the web browser window exactly what the web page should look like, right? So these are the four things that typically do this. And when we talk about React, the way that we think about it is we don't think about going in and manipulating the DOM directly, okay? The virtual DOM manages the state of the DOM for you. So one of the things that you have to shift almost immediately when you start working with React is you have to think of the DOM as being a stateful data structure rather than thinking of I need to go and manipulate something directly on the web page. I need to go and add in something into a div or something like that, right? You have to think in terms of components, and you have to think in terms of the state of the web application, the single page web application that you have at that given point in time, right? So the virtual DOM manages the DOM state. And the smart diffing allows us to reduce the number of changes that need to be applied. Now, you don't really need to concern yourself too much about what's going on underneath the hood. You just have to follow the programming style in React. Basically, you use web components. You never manipulate the DOM directly by going and grabbing an element and changing the inner HTML or something on it. Okay? Again, batch DOM updates allow us to do 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 different things that we want to apply in the web browser. They all get batched into one packet, get applied into the virtual DOM, and then that gets mirrored into the DOM, the real DOM in one shot. Instead of doing 5 different things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at a time, React will batch all those things up and apply it just once so that you reduce the number of reflows and repaint, and that's what makes React run really fast in the browser. All right, so some of that introduction done, let's talk about some React basics. Now, React is a component-based library, so you don't go and manipulate the DOM. You work with React components, you manage the state of those React components, and the state of those components will get applied into the actual view of the web browser. Okay, we're going to look at this in just a second so you see exactly what this looks like. Right? So the basic building blocks are what's known as JSX. This is JavaScript XML syntax. This is a specific format that they came up with, which essentially mixes JavaScript and markup together. Right? We'll get into that in just a sec. We'll look at an example. Right? So the basics of this is, you can see on this screen we have React.render component. And you can see that I have a tag at the top that lets the JSX parser know that this is a JSX block of code. And you can see we have some HTML in there, right? We just have a simple H1 that says hello world. And what we're doing when we do React.render component is we're saying, go and render this specific component, or this, in this case, this specific markup with the H1 tag into this place in the DOM. In this case, we're just essentially rendering this into something called myDiv. Okay? So this is the render part of the component, and we'll look at how you create your own component in just a sec. But key to know that JSX is HTML-like. It's not exactly like HTML. It differs a little bit from HTML. If you go to the URL that's at the bottom of this slide, they have about 3 or 4 major gotchas that you have to keep track of as you're writing JSX. One of the biggest ones is when you're writing JSX, we go back to this previous slide, we have an H1 tag. If we wanted to apply a class into this H1 tag, we don't use the class keyword. You have to use class name instead of class. Okay? So that's what I mean. There are a couple of little small things like that that you have to be aware of when you're writing JSX. One of those, for example, is you can't use the class keyword. You have to use class name. And what React does underneath the hood is it takes that and it changes it into class later. So there are a couple of little caveats in terms of writing JSX. Okay? So, and some people don't like to mix essentially what looks like markup and JavaScript code together. So what you can do is you don't actually have to use the JSX format. You can actually write everything in JavaScript if you want. Okay? So if we look at the previous example, just written using React classes, this is what it would look like. We would do react.dom.h1, right? This is essentially React's underlying wrapper for an H1 element. And you can see I have hello world, and we're injecting it into the DOM at the same location. So this code is equivalent to what we had before. Right? So you have access in the React.dom object to all the HTML elements that you need access to. Okay? So there are 2 ways you can do this. You can write JSX, have markup inside of it, or you can also write JSX. Sorry, you can also use React directly by accessing the React DOM library. Okay? So, and what the React.dom does again is it mirrors essentially the structure and all the different things, tags and stuff that you have inside of a normal web browser. Okay? Basically the HTML. All right. So, a couple of things. When we looked at the previous 2 examples, what's the component we want to render? And where do we want to mount that component? So the concept of mounting is something that most folks aren't used to. This is something that they've introduced, right? So the concept is you create components, and when you're ready, you mount them, i.e. where does this component, this H1 tag or this table or whatever we're building, where does it go into the DOM, right? Where are we mounting it? And there's a life cycle around when things get mounted. There's a callback that gets fired before something's mounted, after it's been rendered, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll look at that in just a second. Again, render component. This is the component. Where are we going to attach it into the DOM? All right, so let's talk about actually creating components, because you don't typically render a component with an H1 tag like we had in the previous example. What you do is you actually create a component, a React component specifically, like this. So you say React, create class, and you can see we have a render property here. This is what actually gets called when React is getting ready to render, i.e. apply something into the virtual DOM, which will eventually make its way into the real DOM, right? So you can see in this code example, we have return H1 hello world, and obviously this is in JSX syntax. We could have used the class-based syntax if we wanted to, okay? So we've created a custom component here. We just called it my component. Right, so once we have that, we do React render component. Remember from the previous slide, variable my component equals React.create class. And here you can see in the middle, we have open, close tags around the my component, and this is what will essentially get mounted into this specific location in the div. So we've created a component in this case, which in this case is just a H1, right? Nothing too fancy. But we'll get into some more complex examples in a minute. All right, so we talked about how you create a component. We talked about how you actually take a component and show it in the web browser. Let's talk about some of the attributes that are available to you inside of a React component. Okay, so here you can see that I have, similar to before, create a component called my component, and in the middle you'll see I have this.props.name. So what we can do is we can pass in some properties when we first create a component, right? So you can see at the bottom I have React render component. Again, there's my component, and then you can see I have name equals Pratik there. Okay, so that's how I pass in some data when I need to do something inside of a component, right? Basically show some dynamic properties there, right? And you can see the rest of it is basically the same. So this is how we use attributes or properties inside of React, right? So let's do a quick demo. And if you have any questions while I'm going through this, please raise your hand or just shout it out or whatever, okay? Do a quick example to get us going. So I have a React project here. Can you guys read that in the back? Okay, I can make it a little bit bigger, but I eventually run out of space in this window. Okay, I already have this up here running. I have some tooling and other things running in the background, but let's try to do this. Let me see if I can lay this out side by side. Always tricky on a super small screen like this. And by tricky, I mean impossible. I have a few browser windows open there. Okay, so I have some tooling running. I'm running specifically, this is a node project where I'm running a few different things. I'll just show you some of the dependencies we have to give you an idea. So I'm running 6.5, which is ECMAScript 6, but you can see that in my node package.json I have React, and I have some additional tooling here for basically using browser sync to do hot reload in the browser. So as I type code, as you'll see in just a second, let's go into our about.js. Let's put this over here. Right, so again, here's my create class. Somewhere else I'm doing a render. I have a browser sync running for development. So I can come in here and say, hello, Devnexus. Let's spell that properly. Okay, if we save that, you'll see that, well, I didn't mean to change that. I meant to change the link itself. But is it lunchtime yet? So save that. But you can see in terms of how this is actually constructed, if you look in here, I'm using JSX syntax. I have a div, h1. This link is using a specific library called Reactor Router. We're not going to get too much into that right now, but hopefully you get the general idea here, right? This is how we created a component. Let's look at another component really quickly. Okay, we have some other stuff here, but if you look at this, one of the things that you get with React is there's something called Reactify. So when you're running in kind of a hybrid environment, which is what I'm doing here, i.e. I'm running Node on the server, obviously the web browser is executing JavaScript. I'm able to write this JavaScript JSX code, and because I have a hint in here that this is JSX, I have something running in the background that's taking this JSX and essentially taking, splitting apart the markup and the JavaScript and creating a JavaScript object from it. Okay, so there's something very specific called Reactify, which I have in my dependencies that does the JSX to JavaScript magic underneath the hood. Okay, so if we look at that, we'll talk about some of these lifecycle methods in a minute, but there's component will mount. That's something that runs before the component actually mounts, and there's also component has mounted, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually inject in your code for different phases of when something is about to be shown, when something is getting shown, and after something has been rendered into the browser. Okay, we'll talk about the lifecycle in just a minute. But this is relatively straightforward, right? We'll look at a more complex example in a few minutes, but I want to start off with something that was pretty straightforward. Right? So you can see we have in here, we have some meta tag. This is rendering the head component specifically for this little example. So we go back here, we go into app.js, and we'll have a couple of different things. This is home, right? Yeah, my home page, right? So we can come in here and do this. Right? But again, you can see that we're not doing anything fancy here. This is essentially just markup. I have mixed in some React Router stuff, which is what the link stuff here is, but you get the idea. Okay? These are basic components. We have some plumbing set up around it that's easily available. There are lots of samples around this, so, and I have the sample actually on my GitHub account as well. Okay? It's just PR Patel GitHub. All right. So let's talk about the component specifications for a few minutes, now that we've seen some code and done some examples. So there are a few things that I'd like to highlight. The first thing is, inside of a component, there are a couple of helpful methods, helpful properties that you override as functions. Get initial state, get default properties. There's this concept of mixins, which I'll get into in just a second, that allows you to easily reuse code between different components for these life cycles, right? So the mixin allows you to create one block of code somewhere, and then instead of having to copy and paste code for those component lifecycle functions, you can just mix it in using a mixin. And what a mixin looks like is something like this. I can create something called log mixin. Component did mount is a part of the React lifecycle, right? And you can see I'm not doing anything fancy here. It's just doing a console.log. But when I create a component, you can see on the second block of code, I say component2 react.create class. Here are the mixins that I wish to mix in terms of the lifecycle properties for this specific React component. Does the concept of mixins make sense in terms of how it fits into the lifecycle? Okay. Right. So again, you can see component did mount is part of the React.js lifecycle. Just reuse it in multiple places by using a mixin. Right? Saves you from having to copy and paste code. So speaking of the lifecycle, component will render, component did mount, component did unmount. So if you make a change in your React application in some way and it removes something from the actual view from the web page, it will fire this callback function or fire this function when that component unmounts. So you can do some cleanup or whatever you need to do, right? And we'll look at a couple of examples of where we used component did mount, component did get initial state, and a few other things to kind of give you an idea of when those things are useful. All right. So what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about, and this is the toughest thing that people generally have a problem with when they start using React, is understanding that you don't manipulate the DOM directly. But the way that you think about React is you basically think of React or working with React in terms of working with state. You never think of React in terms of working directly with elements inside the DOM, in the web page, in the web browser. You always think of it in terms of what is the state of the application now, and how do I need to change the state to achieve what I'm trying to do. If I need to populate like a search window, someone enters something in the search box, when they hit enter, you go out and get some data, that data comes back, that data is the new state, i.e. the search results that I wish to show inside of the web browser. So you have to fundamentally rethink how you approach the browser. You're not necessarily thinking about it in terms of templating, you think about it in terms of state. Currently the state is this. Once the user enters in something into the search box and hits search, what's the new state going to be after that? So we think about it in terms of state. Okay, it's very important to shift your thinking, because again, the last thing you want to do when you work with React is directly manipulating the DOM. You always think about in terms of how do I manipulate the state and give the new state to React for it to render for me. Right? So let's take a quick example of this. So you can see here I have get initial state, right? This is, you don't typically do something like this in terms of you don't hard code the initial state. You usually pass in the initial state as a properties, as I showed before. Remember when I passed in my name into a React component, you typically do not hard code the state like this, right? But for this example, I just want to give you an idea of what you can do in initial state and how that state is used. Right? So I initialize the state when that component gets initialized, and you can see here in the last line of code that I'm doing this.state.count to get the state of that specific component out of the React component for it to render. Okay? So this is how you access the state. You use the this.state variable to get access to the state and also to set the state. All right, we'll look at that when we do an example in a few minutes. Right, the other big thing that people sometimes have difficulty learning when we talk about React, get state-driven approach, you don't directly manipulate the DOM. The other thing is that, remember, we're using a virtual DOM which sits on top of the real DOM that you have in the web browser. The corollary to that is you also have a event layer that's wrapped on top of the actual events which are in the browser. So in React, you're wrapping the DOM in the virtual DOM. The virtual DOM also wraps events in the browser. Okay? So what this looks like, we'll talk about, we'll look at some code in just a minute. But basically what that wrapped event layer does, it's what we call synthetic events. Okay, so everything kind of funnels through this virtual DOM, events funnel through the using synthetic events through the virtual DOM, and the event layer, again, is also cross-browser, and they basically wrap low-level native events. Okay? So, if we look at another example here, right? We can include a arbitrary function property which is mapped to a function in this case called increment count, and you can see again what we're doing is we're doing this dot set state, and then we're just setting it again. This, you don't typically set the initial state like this, but you can in this specific counter example, right? But this is how we go and set the state, right? Passing in a specific property allows us to set the state, and then we can go use the state at whenever we need to in the render part of a React component. All right, so if we continue on this example, you can see that, again, we talked about state, we talked about wrapping the DOM, and here we're wrapping an event, right? So you can see there's a button here, and we do onClick equals this dot increment count. If you remember increment count, that's this guy right here. It's just an arbitrary property that's mapping to a function that we have inside the component. All this is happening inside a component, okay? It's not outside the React component itself, right? Again, onClick. It will get intercepted by the React framework because, again, this is JSX, so you know it wraps the DOM. It also wraps the event. This onClick doesn't directly map into a click in the browser necessarily. It's a wrapped event. Okay, and you can see kind of how we use this at the end. We do React render component counter, get the document by ID, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So when we change the state, when we hit set state, that's what causes a refresh of that component. It doesn't necessarily happen immediately, but it essentially sends a signal to React and says, we have new state in this component. If you need to go change something, go change something. Again, it's a state-driven approach. We don't think about it in terms of actually manipulating something in the browser, i.e. manipulating the inner DOM or something like HTML, right? We go and say, let's go set the state for this component to be this new state. So, everything okay? Oh. Oh, no, we're good here. Yeah. So, again, set the state. When we hit this dot set state, React wakes up and says, what do I need to change? Right? What's changed in the state? It goes and creates a new virtual DOM look. It creates a new virtual DOM tree. It looks at the virtual DOM it currently has and says, okay, these are the things that need to be changed. I'm going to go apply that new markup based on the render portion of my React component with the new state into the DOM now. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to spend a few minutes looking at a Twitter stream example. And you guys have probably already seen this already today. But let me get my stuff ready here. Let's fire up our other project. Let's make this not so small. Okay. So you guys have probably seen this today already. This is actually a React-based web application. Okay. So let's go reload this. I'm going to restart this. This is running in dev mode. And it looks like it's having trouble connecting to Twitter. That's why it keeps crashing. So what we're doing here is we'll try this one more time. Make sure I'm online. Yeah, it's a little bit of an issue with that. All right, maybe third time's a charm. There we go. All right, So let's reload. Right, you'll see our Twitter example coming in here. I'm just going to walk through some of the components we use to build this. All right. All right. So let's start with the components. This is not the right project. This is the right project. All right. So let's look at some of the components. We'll start from the beginning here. This is our server.js. This is a node-based application. Don't worry too much about the node part. I do want to highlight the isomorphic nature. That's the first thing we talked about at the very beginning, where you can render something on the server, send it up to the browser instead of actually essentially doing everything on the browser, right? The isomorphic, where you can run code on either location. Okay. Let's actually look at our app.js. All right. So you can see here at the top in this example, I have @JSX, react.dom. Okay, and in this case, I have my components in a components folder. This is the tweets app component. And what I'm doing here, you can see I'm doing react.render components. There's my tweets app, right? We'll look at that specific React component in just a second, where to mount it inside the HTML. I also will show you the HTML quickly, right? So we're mounting this into React apps. If we look at this, you can see here is the HTML fragment. I'm just using a template underneath for the original Bootstrap of the overall web page, okay? Nothing too crazy here. But let's get back to our components and let's look at that tweets app. Right. So you can see I have a bunch of different things in here. Obviously, I'm requiring React. Tweets is the subsection that we have here. So this panel right here, where the big panel with all the tweets, is the tweets component. This panel right here on the left, where the schedule is, that's the schedule component. This is the header component, and this is the announcements component. Okay. So if we look at this, you'll see this is the announcement bar. This is that tweets panel, schedule panel. These are all React components. This is 100% components, right? Everything is components, basically. What I'm using here at the bottom, all these little things here, is a library called React-Bootstrap. So most people are familiar with Bootstrap, or at least know what it is, right? It's a kind of front-end CSS type of library. But there's nice kind of integration with React. These folks have essentially rewritten all the Bootstrap components to be React components. And what I have to do is I have to import them, as you can see, for a button and a grid and column and rows and wells, etc., in this specific component. Okay? But let's go look at the render part of this first, and we will dig into some of the lifecycle functions in just a second. Okay? So if you look in here, these tags, for example, grid, row, column, panel, these are all React Bootstrap components. Right? I didn't have to use this, but I was going to use Bootstrap anyway, so it's nice. If you look at this, normally what would you do? You'd have, you'd write some divs and, you'd have some, whatever, H1s and tables and etc. Right? But in this case, I'm using the Bootstrap panel and grid layout. Right? So if I go back to the top again, right? So here's React Bootstrap grid. So there's my grid, my row, column, panel, and you can see that this is just a plain HTML tag, just an image tag, okay? But this is my first row. Right here, here's the first subcomponent I'm using under the main tweets app component called announce bar. Here's my schedule component, and here's the tweets component, okay? So those are the major components I have. And let's start off with one of the simple ones, which is the announce bar. Okay, so if we look at the announce bar real quick, you can see it's pretty straightforward. I'm using the Bootstrap panel, right? var panel equals required Bootstrap, React-Bootstrap panel. And then I'm just using a span, and that's essentially what's showing this announcement up here, okay? So that's a simple subcomponent of our major or top-level tweets app component. Let's go look at the tweets part of this. Again, I'm just using, instead of just using plain markup, in this case I'm using React Bootstrap and the components that it provides out of the box. So I have a list group in here. I'll talk about the transitions in just a minute, right? So let's see if this is live. Why are stuff not loading, right? But if you look at the tweet wall later today, and it crashed, that's why. It's like it's unhappy connecting to Twitter right now. Okay.
What version of Node are you running?
Sorry?
There was a bug on Node 0.12 that like.
Is there a bug in Node 0.12 you said?
Yeah.
I'm still running 10. Yeah. I'm a little behind the times in this specific example, but I don't like to live on the bleeding edge usually, so. All right, let's start this back up. We'll continue the walkthrough. So this is the content here. If we go look and see how we built that content, right? This is basically everything for that the entire tweets panel. Right, this is the tweets panel here. You can see what we're doing in the render function is we go and grab the tweets out of the properties. I'll show you how those properties are getting propagated down from the top into this tweets component in just a second. But you can see that I just write this markup, right? So I create one of these tweet components for each one of the tweets that are rendered onto this page. Okay, so I go and iterate over them using a map, right? The tweets is essentially an array of the actual tweet data. I put in the tweet information into this subcomponent called tweet, and then I essentially go and add it into a list group. So if we go look at how that tweet component is created, nothing too crazy again. We have a Bootstrap grid, and you can see that this is where we're injecting in at tweet.screenName and the tweet body, right? There's the tweet name, tweet body. Okay, but you can see that this is a list group item, similar to this, right? So there's your list group items inside of that, right? So hopefully you get the idea here. I'm building components specifically for different parts of the web page, right? So let's take a minute to see how the tweet data is actually flowing from the top. Remember, again, we don't think of working with React in terms of actually going and manipulating the DOM directly. We always think about it in terms of state. So what's the state of my application right now? The state of my app right now is that we have these 4 tweets which are showing, or 5 tweets which are showing right now. Right? When a new tweet comes in, I'm going to change the state of my application to reflect the fact that there's some new data or something. Right? So let's start from the top and work our way down in terms of what that looks like. So here's my tweets app. Actually, let's start at the very, very top. Okay. So this is the very top here. I'm just running a little database that is essentially gathering up the tweets. It's in this tweet object. I probably should have named it like TweetDB or something, but whatever. But the important part that we're interested in is this part right here. All right. So for the initial bootstrap of the application, I'm actually doing the rendering in the server rather than in the browser. So what I do is specifically I say, React, take this component, get all of its subcomponents, and render all of that to a string, put it into this thing called markup, I apply it into a template, and that's what actually gets pushed up to the web browser. So I'm actually doing the initial render on the server rather than letting React render everything in the browser initially. Right? So you might be saying, well, this is a single page web application. Why would I want to do the render on the initial render on the server as opposed to doing the initial render in the web browser itself? Because typically when you write let's say you're writing an Angular-based application, what happens is everything gets set up in the browser, and everything the initial setup and everything happens in the browser, right? But for this specific application, we have quite a bit of stuff going on, right? We have the schedule and we have all these tweets and blah, blah, blah. So it actually makes sense for us to render this on the server because we can render it super duper fast on the server, render to string like we have up here. And we can say, you know what? Here's a pre-rendered initial snapshot of the web page. What that allows me to do is as soon as the user opens the web browser, instead of having to, still has to load the React library on the browser, of course, right? It'll load all the libraries like React and jQuery, et cetera, whatever you're using, right? But specifically React. But what I'm doing is instead of starting from scratch in terms of having to construct the entire view in the browser, I say, here's the markup, just go, right? The web browser is super, super duper fast at taking static markup and showing it very quickly, right? It's when you start injecting JavaScript and doing dynamic things that it gets slow. But when I do the initial render on the server, I go ahead and let the server go ahead and create all the HTML, hand it to the browser shows it instantly, and then the app becomes live. That's when React on the browser takes over and says, okay, you've given me what the initial snapshot of the entire web page looks like. I'm going to render that for you instantly, and then I'm going to wake up, become alive, and start doing the dynamic things that you need me to do, right? So if we watch this for a few minutes, you'll see that a tweet will scroll in whenever a new tweet about Devnexus is, right there, it just happened, right? So the app is actually, even though we sent an initial static representation of our web page to the browser, when React receives it in the browser, it says this is the initial state, right? The initial the initial HTML that you want to show it instantly. React wakes up, it starts working underneath the hood and doing all of our stuff. Okay? Right, so this is the isomorphic part of this. One of the isomorphic parts of this. So, and I see Jonathan just tweeted, hey y'all, so he wanted to get on the tweet wall. Fair enough. All right, so this is where we're starting. And if we look here, you can see we do the render to string. In this case, I should probably call this tweets app component or something like that. Right, name it a little bit better instead of my component. Okay, right, so here's my component, here's tweets. Again, this tweet thing right here is just a database that I'm using, collecting the tweets as they come in from the Twitter sphere. So I go grab the first 10 or whatever, and you can see right here, that's where I'm passing the initial state. Basically, these are the first 5 tweets to show before you go live and start streaming tweets in from the server, okay? So this is the initial state. So let's walk down. We have the initial tweets that we need. That's our initial state. Let's go into our tweets app, okay, and have a look at how we're setting up the initial state. Okay, so if we look here, here's my get initial state, function props, right? These are the properties that this component got initialized. In this case, this happens to be the top level component. Here's props right here, and you can see that I'm creating a new data structure here where I say props.tweets. That's the tweets that in the previous code, that's this guy right here. So I'm gathering up my initial tweets, passing it into the component. That comes into this component, right, or that comes into initial state. I set an internal data structure that I wish to use as the initial state, obviously, but that initial state contains the initial tweets that I have. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? How we're kind of pushing the state down into the components. And from here, now that I have this tweets that I've initially given my entire single page application, the top level component called tweets app, what I do is I take that, and remember we have that tweets panel here. This is the tweets panel right here. And we have a tweets subcomponent here as well that shows basically the list of tweets. Right? You can see what I do is I pass that a bit further down. So I receive it at the top level component. The tweets component needs to have the tweet data, so I pass it in. Right? That's what I've highlighted on the screen right here. You guys see that? Or is it kind of difficult to tell if it's highlighting or not? Right? But basically this part right here. Tweets equals this.state.tweets. And that's how the state gets pushed down into a subcomponent. Right? So how are we doing the dynamic changes once the web page is actually live and streaming the tweets in? I mean, what I have running here is I'm just using a simple, and it's not here. Let's go into the stream handler. Right? What I'm doing is I'm essentially using socket.io or a WebSocket. So once the browser, once the app becomes live in the browser, it connects back via socket.io back to our server, where I'm running a socket.io server, obviously. And then whenever a new tweet comes in, so I have a background process running, pulling tweets in from Twitter. Whenever a new tweet comes in, it opens up on this guy right here. And what I do is I say io.emit, i.e. on the socket.io port on the tweets channel, send the tweet data out to anybody who's listening. Okay, so if we go look at who's receiving it, this is, again, socket.io server running on the server. This is how I'm sending data over a socket.io pipe. We go back into our tweets app, and I'm just going to go to the top and do a search for it. Okay, now this is on the browser. I say make a socket.io connection back to the server. okay, or WebSocket connection back to the server. Whenever that WebSocket receives a tweet, do self.addTweet, right? So I received a tweet on the browser now. Got that bit of data to show the updated tweet, right? Again, those are the tweets that are flowing in here on the right side, right? So I have a function in here called addTweet. I take that new tweet, and right here, you can see I have this array called updated, and unshift basically puts it at the top of the array instead of the end of the array, right? And then I go in and I update my internal data structure, which again, it's all about state. I update the state of the data in my application, right? Now, once I've done this, you can see I'm not doing a set state here yet though, right? I could do a set state in here, but for this specific application, I only want to update this every 5 seconds, because if I were to just have it updated, you know, if everybody tweeted it once, it would just scroll by really fast, right? And that wouldn't be any fun. So what I have in here is I have a timer called set interval. I'm using set interval for a timer. Just this dot display new tweets every 2,000 milliseconds, every 2 seconds, see if there's any new tweets to show. So if we go look at display new tweets, you'll see in here, we say, hey, are there any new tweets available? Because we don't want to unnecessarily bother the React engine and say, hey, here's some new tweets, and then it goes and does a bunch of diffing and says, well, you didn't send me anything new, so I'm not going to update anything, right? So we just avoid that altogether because this is running on a timer, right? But you can see right here on line number 29, I have this dot set state. I say, okay, we have some new tweets. Let's update the state of our application. Here's the new tweets. You go and figure out how to show everything now, okay? So this is how, basically end-to-end, how this is working. Right? So if we dig into what happens is the state will get set in this top level tweets app component. This is at the very, very top of our component hierarchy. Right? When we trigger this dot set state, it comes down into our render. It says, okay, this is what I need to render. And again, you might be thinking that, well, we're going to re-render the whole web page here, right? Because this is a big render block. It's basically the entire web page. But what actually, again, what happens is because of the virtual DOM, we can just say, you know, go and update everything. Here's the new state. But everything doesn't actually get updated. What it does is it'll take that new data structure, it'll get injected again into this state.tweets, which will get passed down into here, right? Here's our props.tweet, right? Because you pass a property to it. You pass state to a subcomponent using properties, right? So when we passed tweets equals this down into the tweets component, which is this guy right here, that gets put into this dot props. The variable name we use was tweets. We iterate over it. We say, here are the new tweets. Create a list group, right? And again, I'm just walking all the way down to the bottom again. This is the individual tweet, so now we're in the actual low-level tweet component at the very bottom, basically just this part right here. And it goes and it builds everything up. And after it's built everything, it says, okay, this is what the DOM currently looks like. This is the snapshot I have of the current state of the DOM. You went in and set the state, new state. This is what the state currently looks like. I'm going to do a diff of the two. And I'm only going to apply the delta, only the changes. So I'm not refreshing the entire web page or redoing the entire web page. React is smart enough to look at the state you have and the brand new state of the whole thing, and it says I only need these 2 elements or these 4 elements that need to get updated. I'm going to take the markup, which is basically this stuff right here. I'm going to create the diff, and I'm going to apply it in one shot into the web browser. Okay? So we've gone all the way from the top to the bottom now. Hopefully, this is all making sense so far, right? Anyone completely lost yet? No? Okay. All right. So a couple of other things I want to show really quickly. We've looked at the JSX, but we haven't looked at the markup, the CSS very much. All right, so we've basically just kind of been focusing on the kind of HTML and JSX. Right? But you can see I have a styles.css in here. This is something I import, obviously. And I have just my styles here in a separate CSS file. Okay? So you can see I have some colors and, you know, what's the color for the room or background color, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So this is just standard CSS. In this case, For this specific application, I chose to use React Bootstrap because it gave me a lot of nice components out of the box that I didn't need to write. You can write your own components for very specific little widgets that you need to write, okay? Someone is actually, there are lots of people working on React component libraries right now. This is the most mature one that I've seen so far, but there are lots of people working on, for example, I've seen one for Foundation. So someone is creating essentially a port of the Foundation user interface library into React components, so you could use it in a similar way just by using the tags. Okay. All right, so let's see what else we want to talk about here. There's a bunch of other stuff going on here, but I don't want to get too much into some of the ancillary things that are happening. Oh yeah, one thing I did want to show actually is we'll talk about React Router in a minute. Okay, well, let's go back to our slide deck. So we walked through the full example. We looked at everything using Socket.io. I'm using a combination of server rendering. Again, the server rendering for the initial Bootstrap that I did was right here. Right, this when I do React render to string. Right, normally what do? Normally I would do a React.render, and that renders it in the web browser. But in this case, again, I want to render this on the server, create a string that I go and push up into the web browser. That essentially runs on the server. The reason we did that was to get that extremely fast initial page load time. Okay, and once React takes over on the browser, it becomes live. All right. All right, so we already looked at the Tweets app component. That was a top level component. All right, we looked at the JSX. We talked about the render. One thing we didn't talk about, let's go back and talk about some of the lifecycle methods really quickly. All right, we talked about a few of them. Okay, so these are all my functions. Right, so here's my initial state. Again, get the initial state, and then one of the things that you do, once the component is live, you can use the component did mount property to affix a function to, and say, once the component's been mounted and is shown, I want to go do some stuff. In this case, what I want to do is, as we saw before, I want to create a Socket.io connection, and then as tweets are coming in, go update the state, et cetera, right? But this is where you can nominally plug in stuff for the component has been shown in the web browser. I need to go do some stuff. So you use component did mount for that kind of thing. All right, if I go into a different one, find a good example for you really quickly here. All right, so this is our schedule. Right, again, you can see initial state. This is the schedule part of this. When the component mounts, go run the schedule parser. And basically go load the schedule, the most recent JSON for the schedule, and go render it essentially. And then you can see I update the schedule every 5 minutes by using a set interval. But again, the point here is I'm using component did mount, get initial state, and I could use component did unmount for when something gets pulled off the DOM and destroyed, so I can run some cleanup or whatever. Okay. See if there's anything else interesting in here in terms of. Right, so there's component did mount, a few other things in here, initial state, so where I'm handling a submit, et cetera, okay? All right, so I've already looked at this stuff, so I'm not going to go over it again. Right. We talked about isomorphic, how we can go render something on the server. Right, and again, I'm using Node.js to do this. You do have to have a JavaScript runtime to obviously run JavaScript, okay? So if you're running on the JVM, unfortunately, most Node.js libraries do not work in the JVM. There was a project called Project Avatar where they were trying to do that, but there hasn't been much work on that recently. So you do kind of need to run basically Node on the server to be able to get this isomorphic capability. Because you have to be able to run the JavaScript on the browser in the server if that is your intent. You don't have to do that, right? If you're building an Angular application, you can just have everything just run on the web browser. You don't have to do any of this pre-rendering on the server if you don't want to. Again, the point is that it gives you a huge amount of flexibility in terms of being able to run some code that is expensive in terms of CPU or performance or whatever on the server if you want. All right, so we talked about this. Generate an initial page on the server. New data is rendered in the browser. Okay, how does this come together? We looked at how we set the state, right? Set state invokes render for components, for that component and all subcomponents. So it basically, in our case, we started at the top of the tree and we worked all the way down, right? So it basically goes and checks the state of everything and creates that virtual DOM snapshot, okay? But again, you know, you may think that you're starting at the top and you're setting the state all the way down for all these components, right? We have a ton of components on this web page. If we go look at this, right, let's just do a quick count. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is the panel, 8, 9, 10, well, whatever. There's about 30 or 40 components on here, okay? Probably more actually, right? Let's say 50 components on this web page, okay? And you might think, well, why would you want to? Why does React go in and do a full render of everything if we start at the top, right? When we start at the top, we're doing everything. It's like, what, Pratik, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just re-render the tweets panel instead of re-rendering the whole thing, right? It's kind of crazy. Why do you start and re-render the whole thing? Won't that be slow? In actuality, again, remember, the virtual DOM handles the diffing and kind of the mirroring of the underlying DOM for you. And actually in JavaScript, constructing objects and essentially doing like the whole kind of a virtual DOM rendering of the new state is actually really, really fast. You use a little bit of memory, but it's not slow at all, okay? The virtual DOM handles all that for you. All right, we talked about this already. Virtual DOM, batch DOM updates, smart diffing. You can just tell it to go and re-render all the components and then only apply the diffs. You don't have to worry about all that stuff. It just does it for you. Okay. Let's look at. We talked about the server code already, and I want to end with a couple of interesting things. So in terms of doing animations, right? If you remember from this, whenever a new tweet comes in, it slides in from the left, right? Slides in from the right to left, right? What we're actually doing for that is if we go look at the way in our tweet component, what I'm specifically doing is I'm using a React transition group, specifically a CSS transition group. Again, you don't want to go in and directly manipulate the DOM to do anything. So you have to basically use the component-based wrappers. Basically, you have to do it in a component some way, okay? And the way to do it in React is we use a CSS transition group. The transition name that I'm specifically applying here is called example, right? And will get applied for all the kind of subcomponents that are within this React transition group component. So if we go look at the styles for that, right? If you remember, that thing was called example, and that specific thing was React transition group, transition name, example. So everything under that we want to apply this transition to, right, or animation. So in my CSS, I have example-enter. So it's anchored on the example keyword that I have here. When we're about to mount something, example-enter, right? This is basically the component coming into the view, right? You can see what we do is we do a translate, essentially move it from the far right into the left. So we're just doing a simple CSS translate here in this case. Do a transform, translate it, move it into the view. When it becomes active, use the ease in, right? I don't want to get too much into the CSS here, but I wanted to show how we do the transition. Example enter, when it becomes active, or when something gets unmounted, i.e. you're getting rid of something, you can also have something, an animation to show it kind of leaving the screen or whatever, right? Getting unmounted. All right. All right, so let's look at routing for just a minute. So some of the things I'm going to show now are things that are a little bit more advanced in terms of how React actually works with different libraries and kind of how their architecture is. So we've talked kind of the low-level details so far. What I want to do now is I want to talk about some of the kind of add-on libraries that you have in the React world today. Okay? So if we go into our example, first thing I want to show is what's called Reactor Router. That is if I can find it. Okay, so this is an example of React Router. You can see that in my dependencies right here, I require React-Router. This is an add-on library. It doesn't come with React itself. But the idea is you write this kind of markup and you say, here are my routes. This is the handler for this specific route. This is the app handler. My default route, its name is home. The handler for it is just a React component, components/home. Right? You probably saw me hacking this in the first example, right? So here's my home component. You can see it's not really doing much. It's just doing a div h1. And then we have these link properties. When you add React Router, what you do is you use link properties to navigate in different parts of your application. Okay. Again, this is all running on the browser at this point. You can also run it on the server if you want. Let's go back to our routes. But you get the idea just by kind of eyeballing this, right? We have, here's the about path. This is the handler we use for the about path, right? Here's the not found handler. All of these are React components underneath the hood. Not found, about, home, app. They're all React components. Specifically, again, what we're doing here is we're using React Router, okay? I don't actually use React Router yet for the stuff that I'm building, but I know lots of people have started using this, and I've played around with it. It's pretty good. But I'll get into some of the philosophy around this in just a minute, right? And some of the choices I made in terms of building something. Right, so we talked a lot about setting state, right? We don't want to manipulate the DOM. When we work in React, we need to think in terms of state. That's how we interact with our web application as a developer, right? That's how we build it. Think in terms of state. So we have this concept of one-way data flow in React. Right? I'm gonna talk about these little boxes specifically in just a minute. But if you think about how Angular does things, for example, what is one of the key things that people always talk about when they talk about Angular? Two-way data binding, right? So you have arrows going back and forth between the view and the whatever, model, controller layer, whatever, right? Two ways. But in React, we think about things in terms of only flowing in one direction. If you look at this diagram, you can see we start at the top and we go down and we go around. There's no arrow going from view upwards. It will always flow down to the view. One-way data binding. Data binding is probably not the right word. Basically, one-way data flow. That's how we have to think about React, okay? So a couple of things I want to mention that are also on this slide. This is essentially a snapshot of what's known as the React Flux architecture, F-L-U-X. So they have an overall kind of architecture in terms of how is basically best practices for building React-based applications, right? And you can actually go and get libraries for React that implement the store, the dispatcher, and the action, okay? So there's that, no, again, React is only a view layer library. So if you're using something like Angular, you don't need any of this stuff, right? Because Angular provides the stores and the controllers and blah, 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 right? You're just using React as a view-based library. However, if you're just starting on a greenfield project, you're not using Angular, you just want to use React, React doesn't actually give you anything in terms of the M and the C. Right? I'm not saying that you necessarily need that, but you do need some additional plumbing around your application to write like a real single-page web app. So you can look at the Flux architecture. That's kind of like the recommended or best practice way of doing things. For the React apps that I'm building, I actually don't use Flux at this point in time because I think it's a little bit in flux. Haha, yes, bad pun. I think it's a little bit in flux. So the React library itself is extremely stable. Lots and lots of people are using it. Some of the kind of plumbing and tooling around it, like React Router, the Flux architecture, implementations of the Flux architecture, those things are still a little bit kind of in the maturing phase. So I'm not ready to jump in wholeheartedly on that. Number one, because I think there's still some maturing that needs to go on with these things. Second reason is, at this point in time at least, my opinion is that adding in the Flux architecture with the stores and the actions and the corresponding libraries, it makes the app too complex, right? When I'm writing code, whether it's in JavaScript in React, or I'm writing iOS code, or I'm writing Android code, or whatever, I try to write code as simply as possible, right? I try to avoid making things complex. Even though as a developer, your natural instinct is to write the most complex thing possible, right? You have to resist that urge. And so with React, I try to resist the urge to add in too much stuff, make stuff too complicated from kind of a top, how am I thinking about my application, how am I implementing my application level. All right, so with that, I've already given my 2 cents about Flux. I think in the future, it'll get better and it'll be simpler, and there are people doing interesting things in this area in terms of the overall architecture. React itself, though, is rock solid, very usable. We're using it for a bunch of stuff. I have some links here at the bottom in terms of references. I think we're going to be uploading the slides later this week, and obviously the video will be out soon too. So, can I take some questions? I think we have, what, a couple of minutes? 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes for questions. Okay. Any questions?
I had a question about using React with Angular. What goes about during the integration process? I saw a few tutorials online, but they make it seem very tedious, the integration aspect.
Integration with what?
From Angular, integration from Angular to React. Yeah.
So the question is I looked up some React Angular integration stuff. It looks a little tedious. Unfortunately, I don't really use Angular, so I can't give you a good recommendation on that. So, yeah. Yeah. I'm not a big fan of Angular. Is this still recording? I'm not a big fan of Angular, so I think Angular is compared to React and the way we build components here, and we kind of think of the way we model our web page and how we kind of work with the one-way data flow. I find it's super, super simple. I can keep it all in my brain. And I wrote this Tweets app literally in 2 hours one day. Okay, it didn't take me long at all to write it. Right? Most of the time was just setting up the plumbing to do live browser sync during development. Okay, but that's why I like it. It's super simple. I can keep everything in my brain in terms of the architecture. And in my opinion, hopefully they'll cut this out. In my opinion, Angular is just way too complicated. It has a very low learning curve initially, but you hit a point in Angular where it's just it's like, why is this $scope thing everywhere, and what the hell does it do, right? You guys know what I'm talking about if you do Angular. Right, I find Angular to be way more complicated. React is much simpler, but it gives me a huge amount of power when I'm building a single page web app. So again, that's my opinion. When you see Raju Gandhi today in his Angular talk, give him a hard time about how complex Angular is. He enjoys that. So, okay, more questions? All right, thanks for coming, guys. Let's go get some lunch.